Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something truly chilling. Something that whispers from the ancient past and still sends a shiver down the spine of modern belief. The horrifying diseases attributed to curses in history. Imagine, for a moment, that you're living in a time before microscopes, before vaccines, before even a basic understanding of germs. You wake up with a strange rash, a sudden fever, or a debilitating weakness. And your world, already a precarious dance with survival, crumbles. What do you blame? What can you blame? When every cough could be a death rattle and every unexplained illness feels like a betrayal by the very air you breathe? You're not going to be calling your doctor because your doctor is probably a shaman waving a chicken bone. And your pharmacy is a patch of weeds in the forest. Honestly, if you were dropped into any of these historical periods, your chances of survival beyond a common cold would be, well, let's just say slim to none. Feels optimistic. You'd probably be diagnosed with a curse for sneezing too loudly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And seriously, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how far these stories travel into your cozy, pre-sleep moments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the sun-baked plains of ancient Mesopotamia, a land cradled between two great rivers, where civilization first began to hum. The year is, well, let's just say really ancient. Life here is tough, a constant negotiation with the whims of nature, the rivers, while giving life. Also bring unpredictable floods. The sun, while nourishing crops, can also scorch the earth. And then there are the invisible enemies, the ones that steal breath and bring agonizing pain diseases. You see a neighbor, strong yesterday, now writhing with a fever, their skin erupting in angry pustules. Another, once nimble, now drags a withered limb, their eyes clouded with despair. What do the people here believe? They don't have medical textbooks or germ theory? What they have are powerful gods, spirits, and the concept of divine retribution. To these ancient peoples, illness isn't just a biological malfunction, it's a cosmic event. It's a message, a punishment, a sign that someone, somewhere, has offended a deity or provoked a malevolent spirit. Imagine the terror of waking up with a raging fever, not knowing if it's merely a fever or if you've somehow angered Enlil, the god of wind and storms, or perhaps upset the capricious goddess Lamashtu, who delights in bringing disease and death, especially to children. The air itself feels thick with unseen forces, each one capable of inflicting a different kind of suffering. You might be suffering from a simple bacterial infection, but to the anxious mind of someone from this era, your body isn't just battling microbes, it's battling the wrath of the heavens. The texts, cuneiform tablets painstakingly etched with reed styluses, tell us so much about this worldview. They describe a complex pantheon of gods and demons, each with their own domain over health and illness. There's Pazuzu, a fearsome demon associated with fever and nightmares, often depicted with a dog-like face, lion's paws, and a scorpion's tail. Just picturing that before bed isn't exactly a lullaby. Is it but for the Mesopotamians? These weren't just stories, they were very real threats when someone fell ill. The first question wasn't, what did they eat, but whom did they offend? Perhaps you failed to offer the proper sacrifice, or you spoke ill of a god, or maybe you inadvertently stepped on a sacred anthill. The possibilities for divine displeasure were endless, and the consequences, swift and brutal. So, what's the cure for a curse-induced illness? Not antibiotics. Certainly, the solution often involved appeasement and ritual. You'd seek out an Ashipu, a priest-exorcist who would interpret the god's will and perform elaborate rituals to lift the curse. These rituals could involve incantations whispered under the flickering light of oil lamps, offerings of food and drink to the offended deities, or even symbolic acts like burning effigies of demons. You might find yourself lying on a mat, surrounded by strange herbs and smoking incense, while the Ashipu chanted ancient words. Hoping to coax the sickness demon from your body, it sounds rather dramatic, doesn't it? But consider the alternative: simply waiting for the illness to take its course. With no explanation and no perceived hope. This was their way of fighting back, of making sense of the senseless. One common belief was that certain ailments were caused by the hand of a god, or the touch of a demon. If you suffered from seizures, it might be interpreted as the god Sin, the moon god, gripping you in his celestial fist, a sudden paralysis. Perhaps it was the evil eye of a jealous rival, or a malevolent spirit clinging to your spine. There was a direct, palpable connection between moral transgressions and physical suffering. If you cheated on your taxes, or more accurately, if you didn't offer enough grain to the temple, you might find yourself with a raging headache the next day. Convinced it was divine retribution, this belief system provided a framework, however terrifying, for understanding the inexplicable. It offered a reason, even if that reason was a vengeful deity or a spiteful demon. You see this theme echoed in ancient Egypt, a civilization renowned for its sophisticated medicine, yet still deeply steeped in magical thinking. The Egyptians, with their vast knowledge of anatomy and medicinal plants, still believed that many illnesses were caused by hostile gods, malevolent spirits, or the curses of the dead. Their medical texts, like the Eber's Papyrus, blend practical remedies with magical spells and incantations. For instance, a common headache might be treated with a poultice of herbs, but also with an amulet inscribed with protective symbols, or a chanted prayer to the goddess Sekhmet, the lioness-headed deity associated with plagues and healing. It was a holistic approach, where the physical and the spiritual were inextricably linked. They understood that the body was a vessel, but also believed it was susceptible to external, supernatural influences. Imagine you're an Egyptian peasant, toiling in the fields along the Nile. You develop a painful eye infection, a common affliction in this dusty, sun-drenched land. Your local healer might prescribe a concoction of honey and human milk, which, surprisingly, has some antibacterial properties. But they'd also advise you to wear an Eye of Horus amulet, or to recite a specific incantation to ward off the evil forces believed to be causing your blindness. The lines between medicine, magic, and religion were incredibly blurry. And why wouldn't they be, when faced with the terrifying randomness of disease? Any explanation, however supernatural, offered a modicum of control and a sliver of hope. One common historical truth you find across these ancient cultures is that illness was rarely seen as an isolated biological event. It was always embedded within a larger cosmic or social framework. If you were sick, it wasn't just your body that was out of whack. It was your relationship with the gods, your community, or even the very fabric of existence. This holistic view, while lacking scientific accuracy, provided a psychological balm, a way to cope with overwhelming uncertainty. An obscure detail from ancient Egypt really highlights this. There are records of spells specifically designed to protect against the attack of a dead person. Imagine that, not just ghosts, but the physical illness believed to be brought on by a deceased individual's malevolent spirit. So, if your neighbor died and you suddenly came down with a mysterious cough, it wasn't necessarily a contagion, it could be their spectral revenge. It adds a whole new layer of paranoia to your daily life. Doesn't it? Oh, don't forget to offer a libation to Uncle Bob's tomb, or you might end up with the dreaded phantom limb itch. Historians still debate whether the specific deities invoked for healing or cursing in ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts were seen as truly causing the diseases themselves, or if they were more metaphorical representations of the unknown forces at play. Were these gods the direct agents of sickness, or merely the symbols used to understand the chaos that disease wrought? It's a fascinating question, a subtle distinction that speaks volumes about the human mind's attempt to rationalize suffering. Did they truly believe that a god literally reached down and put a fever in your body? Or was it more like saying, God's will, when something inexplicable happened? We may never truly know the nuance of their inner beliefs. Lost to the sands of time, as you drift through the dry, dusty air of these ancient lands, you can almost hear the low chants of the Ashipu, the rustle of papyrus as a priest reads a healing spell, and the desperate pleas of those suffering from ailments they believed were curses from an offended deity. The belief was not a mere superstition, it was a deeply ingrained worldview, a lens through which every ache, every tremor, and every breath was filtered. And as we leave these ancient empires behind, you can feel the heavy weight of that belief, a precursor to the many more terrifying and often misunderstood diseases to come. The fear of the curse, the dread of divine punishment, was just beginning its long, insidious journey through human history. You're leaving the sun-drenched plains of ancient empires now, stepping through the dim, misty forests and cobbled pathways of medieval Europe. The air is cooler, heavier, often thick with the smoke of hearth fires and the faint, unsettling scent of unwashed bodies. It's the Middle Ages, a time of profound faith and pervasive fear, where the invisible threads of superstition are woven deeply into the tapestry of daily life. Here, the concept of disease as a curse doesn't just cling to the divine, it descends to a much more terrifying, human-level witchcraft. Imagine you're a humble peasant, living in a small, cramped village where everyone knows everyone else's business, and suspicion can fester like an untreated wound. Suddenly, your prize cow, your family's lifeline, inexplicably stops giving milk, or perhaps it just drops dead in the pasture. Bloated and silent. Or maybe your child, who was playing in the dirt just yesterday, wakes up screaming with a fever that no herbal poultice seems to touch. What's your first thought in an era defined by illiteracy, isolation, and a deep-seated belief in both God and the devil? Your mind often jumps to the most chilling explanation: a curse, whispered by a malevolent neighbor, a resentful outcast, or worst of all, a witch. The medieval mind wasn't equipped with germ theory. Remember, they didn't understand pathogens spreading from person to person. Instead, they saw connections between misfortunes and perceived moral failings. Or, more insidiously, between suffering and the dark arts. If a crop failed, if a well dried up, if a plague swept through the village. The question wasn't how, but who, and often. That who was a solitary old woman living on the edge of the woods, perhaps skilled in herbal remedies, but now eyed with deep suspicion. Her knowledge, once tolerated, now seemed sinister. Her strange habits, once quaint, now seemed proof of a pact with the devil. You can practically feel the tension in the village square as whispers turn into accusations. Someone falls ill with a wasting sickness, their body growing thinner and weaker by the day, their skin pale, their eyes sunken. The local priest might offer prayers, but the villagers, desperate for an explanation, will often turn to blaming anyone for this inexplicable suffering. It's a cruel irony, the very communities that were supposed to provide solace in times of hardship often became breeding grounds for paranoia and scapegoating when faced with a mysterious disease. The fear of witchcraft wasn't just folklore, it was enshrined in law and church doctrine. From the 14th century onwards, especially, the church began to solidify its stance against witchcraft, seeing it as heresy, a direct affront to God. This meant that if you were accused of being a witch, and therefore of casting curses that caused illness or misfortune. You weren't just committing a civil crime, you were committing a spiritual one, punishable by the most horrific means. Think about the psychological impact of this. If you developed a strange, debilitating illness, not only were you suffering physically, but you might also fear that you were the victim of a curse, or even worse, that you were somehow tainted, causing your own misfortune. Or if you were a healer, trying to help people with traditional remedies, one failed treatment could easily lead to accusations of having caused the illness with your own dark powers. It was a no-win situation for many. The symptoms of certain diseases were particularly ripe for misinterpretation as evidence of a curse. Conditions like epilepsy, with its sudden violent seizures and loss of consciousness, were often seen not as a neurological disorder, but as the individual being possessed by demons, or afflicted by a powerful hex. Imagine witnessing someone you know suddenly collapse, their body convulsing uncontrollably, froth appearing at their mouth, their eyes rolling back, without a medical explanation. The supernatural was the only logical leap. The cure then became an exorcism, often a brutal and terrifying ordeal for the sufferer. Rather than any attempt at physical treatment, then there were the skin conditions. Medieval life was often unsanitary, and skin ailments were common. But if a rash was particularly severe, persistent, or disfiguring, it could easily be construed as a mark of a curse, a sign of God's disfavor, or the direct result of a witch's dark magic. Diseases like scrofula, a form of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes, often caused unsightly swellings and lesions, particularly around the neck. It was sometimes known as the king's evil, because it was believed that only the touch of a righteous king could cure it, a blend of divine blessing and a very specific kind of magical cure. If the king's touch didn't work, well, then it wasn't the king's fault. It was your lack of faith, or perhaps a stronger curse at play. It was always a convenient out. The fear of curses also extended to infertility or difficult childbirth, for couples desperate for children, or for women experiencing repeated miscarriages. The inability to conceive or carry to term was often heartbreakingly attributed to a curse, particularly if a rival or an envious individual had a motive. The pressure on women to bear children was immense, and the failure to do so could lead to accusations of witchcraft or of being cursed by God. This added an unbearable psychological burden to an already emotionally devastating situation. You weren't just experiencing a biological difficulty, you were seen as potentially being targeted by dark forces. A common historical truth from this era is that social anxieties and misfortunes were often projected onto individuals perceived as outsiders or different. The witch hunts, which reached their peak later but had roots in this period, weren't just about genuine belief in magic. They were also about finding scapegoats for widespread fear. Crop failures, economic downturns, and, yes, inexplicable outbreaks of disease. When a community was suffering, finding a tangible enemy, even a fabricated one, offered a perverse sense of control. An obscure detail about medieval curses relates to the belief in elf shot. This was a common explanation for sudden, sharp pains, paralysis, or even mysterious illnesses in both humans and livestock. It was believed that invisible arrows shot by mischievous or malevolent elves or sometimes fairies could strike down a person or animal, causing immediate illness. So, if you suddenly felt a stabbing pain in your side, it wasn't appendicitis, it was an elf with a tiny bow and arrow. The cure? Often a charm stone or an amulet, sometimes even a flint arrowhead found in a field, believed to be the actual elf arrow and therefore capable of reversing the curse. It's a quirky blend of fantasy and genuine fear. Historians still debate whether the intensity of witchcraft accusations in certain periods and regions was primarily driven by religious dogma. social upheaval, economic hardship, or indeed by genuine psychological phenomena experienced by the accusers or the accused? Was it truly belief in curses? Or was it a convenient tool for control, power, and the elimination of undesirables? It's a complex web of factors that makes understanding this dark chapter of history so challenging. What's clear is that the fear of a curse and the belief that disease could be its manifestation had very real, often tragic, consequences for countless individuals. As you close your eyes and imagine the cold, damp air of the medieval village, you can almost hear the nervous whispers, the hushed accusations, and the desperate prayers. The fear of an unseen curse, a malevolent glance, or a witch's dark incantation loomed large, making every unexplained illness a source of profound terror and suspicion. It was a time when the invisible hand of magic was seen to pluck at the very threads of life, turning health into a fragile gift, easily stolen by a curse. And this dark shadow of supernatural blame will continue to follow us as we journey through more chapters of human suffering and desperate searching for answers. You're now moving deeper into the shadows of history, toward a specific, deeply rooted affliction that for centuries carried the heaviest burden of all leprosy for countless generations. This disease wasn't just a physical ailment, it was seen as a divine curse, a profound moral failing made manifest on the body, a living testament to sin. Imagine you're walking through the dusty streets of an ancient city, or perhaps a medieval village. You see someone on the periphery, their face disfigured, their limbs gnarled, their voice a rasp. People shy away, averting their gaze, whispering. This isn't just fear of contagion, it's a chilling dread of something far more profound. This person isn't merely sick, they are, in the eyes of many, cursed by God. The historical perception of leprosy, or what was often referred to as Hansen's disease, is perhaps one of the most tragic examples of a disease being attributed to a divine curse. You can trace this back to biblical times, particularly the Old Testament. In the book of Leviticus, there are extensive detailed passages about leprosy, which likely encompassed a range of skin conditions. Not just what we now know as Hansen's disease, but the key takeaway for you, as someone living in that era, was terrifying if you developed these symptoms. You were deemed unclean. This wasn't just a medical diagnosis, it was a spiritual and social condemnation. You weren't simply isolated for public health reasons, you were cast out because your affliction was seen as a sign of God's direct wrath, a punishment for an unknown sin, perhaps even a generational curse passed down through your family. You were forced to tear your clothes, let your hair hang loose, cover your upper lip, and cry out, "Unclean, unclean," to warn others of your presence. Imagine the profound psychological toll of such a pronouncement. Not only were you suffering physically, but you were also carrying the crushing weight of spiritual damnation. Your illness wasn't just a challenge to overcome, it was a brand, a mark of impurity. This biblical narrative shaped attitudes towards leprosy for thousands of years, permeating through early Christianity and into the Middle Ages. You see the echoes of this in the leper colonies, or lazarets, that sprang up across Europe. These weren't just hospitals, they were often isolated communities, places of exile where those afflicted were sent to live out their days, separated from clean society. While these institutions sometimes offered care and spiritual solace, their very existence reinforced the idea that leprosy was a disease of separation, a physical manifestation of a spiritual taint. You were literally untouchable, not just because of fear of the disease, but because of the perceived curse upon you. Consider the Crusades, when European crusaders encountered the disease more frequently in the Middle East. Their fear and existing biblical interpretations solidified the notion of leprosy as a moral curse. It was a disease of the other, or a punishment for the unbelievers. Further cementing its spiritual baggage, yet ironically a remarkable group of knights. The Order of Saint Lazarus was founded to care for those with leprosy, showing a counter-narrative of compassion amidst widespread condemnation. The stigma was immense. You might be attending church and suddenly notice a spot, a numbness, or a discoloration on your skin. The immediate, gut-wrenching fear wouldn't just be of the physical symptoms, but of the social and spiritual excommunication that would surely follow. Your family might abandon you, your friends would shun you, and your very existence would become a living death, a testament to a curse. It's hard to fathom the isolation of such a life, compounded by the constant, gnawing question, what did I do to deserve this? What did I, even for those who showed charity towards lepers? It was often framed within a religious context, an act of piety, a way to earn spiritual merit by tending to those cursed by God. Rather than a purely secular act of medical aid, the leper was a symbol, a walking reminder of human frailty and divine judgment. A common historical truth about leprosy is that the social and religious stigma associated with it often caused more suffering than the disease itself. The forced isolation, the loss of family and community, and the profound psychological burden of being considered cursed were often more devastating than the physical symptoms, especially since leprosy often progressed slowly. You weren't just losing your fingers and toes, you were losing your identity, your humanity, and your place in the world. An obscure detail related to the curse of leprosy is the medieval belief that lepers were sometimes seen as conduits for divine messages, because they were so afflicted and set apart. Some believed they were closer to God, or that their suffering somehow granted them special spiritual insight. This led to strange paradoxes where, despite being ostracized, some lepers might be consulted for prophecies or blessings, almost as if their curse also brought a peculiar form of spiritual power. It's a bizarre twist to a deeply tragic narrative. So, you're cursed and outcast. But hey, maybe you can predict next year's harvest. Not exactly a silver lining, but a curious footnote. Historians still debate whether the severe segregation and condemnation of individuals with leprosy in medieval Europe was primarily driven by genuine fear of contagion, despite a limited understanding of how diseases spread, or if it was more deeply rooted in the theological interpretation of the disease as a moral failing or divine punishment. Was it an early, albeit primitive, form of public health measure, or was it a socio-religious mechanism for ostracizing the unclean and reinforcing religious doctrine? The truth is likely a complex interplay of both, but the pervasive belief in a divine curse certainly fueled the fires of fear and ostracism. As you picture the desolate leper colonies, the tolling bells warning of an approaching leper, and the profound despair etched on the faces of those deemed unclean, you can almost feel the chill of a curse that wasn't just a spiritual belief, but a lived reality of unspeakable isolation. This was a disease that shattered lives, not just through physical decay, but through the crushing weight of societal condemnation and the terrifying belief that God himself had turned his face away. And as we move forward, we'll see how other terrifying afflictions also became entangled with the dark threads of curses and moral judgment. You're now stepping into the turbulent, transformative era of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, a period of immense discovery, brutal conquest, and, unfortunately, devastating disease. And at the heart of this unfolding drama is a terrifying new plague, one that would sweep across continents with unprecedented speed and horror: syphilis. But unlike other diseases, which might be seen as a general curse, syphilis very quickly earned a reputation as a moral curse, a punishment for what was considered the ultimate transgression. Imagine you're living in Naples, Italy, around 1495. The city is under siege, a brutal affair with French troops. Suddenly, a new enemy emerges, far more insidious than any army. People begin to develop horrifying lesions, painful sores, and then a grotesque disfigurement of the nose and face. Limbs become swollen, bones ache with an unbearable pain, and eventually, the mind itself begins to unravel. This isn't just sickness, this is an unholy blight, a visible mark of some terrible wrongdoing. The speed with which syphilis, or the Great Pox, as it was terrifyingly known, spread across Europe was astounding. Many theories abound regarding its origins, but one of the most widely accepted is that it arrived in Europe with Christopher Columbus's crew returning from the New World. Whether this is entirely accurate or not, the disease certainly exploded onto the European scene with devastating force, and because of its primary mode of transmission, which was quickly understood even if the microscopic cause wasn't. It quickly became associated with promiscuity and sexual sin. This is where the curse aspect truly solidified, unlike the indiscriminate plague that could strike anyone. Syphilis seemed to target those engaged in what was considered immoral behavior. Therefore, it wasn't just a physical ailment, it was a visible, painful, and often fatal punishment from God for lust and debauchery. You could try to hide your lesions, but eventually, the disease would betray your sins to the world. Imagine the intense shame and terror, not just of the physical pain, but of the public condemnation that came with contracting the Great Pox. Your suffering wasn't just yours, it was a sermon, a living testament to your perceived moral failings. The names given to the disease reflect this immediate blame game. The French called it the Neapolitan disease, blaming the Italians. The Italians called it the French disease. The Germans called it the French evil or the Spanish evil. The Russians called it the Polish disease. Everyone was pointing fingers, but underlying all the nationalistic mudslinging was the universal belief that this horrifying new illness was a curse, inflicted either by God or by some malevolent foreign influence. It was a visible sign of divine judgment, a moral plague. The symptoms were particularly gruesome, especially in its early, virulent forms. The primary stage involved sores or chancres, often on the genitals. Then came the secondary stage, with widespread rashes, often covering the entire body, along with fever, hair loss, and incredibly painful bone aches. Finally, if left untreated, the tertiary stage could manifest years later, leading to blindness, paralysis, dementia, and grotesque lesions that could destroy facial features. You can imagine how these devastating effects, particularly the disfigurement and mental decline, were seen as irrefutable evidence of a divine curse, twisting the body and mind as punishment for the soul. The idea was, you indulged your flesh, and now your flesh is rotting. Charming, medical cures were often as terrifying as the disease itself. Mercury, a highly toxic substance, was a popular treatment. You might undergo mercurial rubs, where mercury ointment was applied to your skin, or even fumigations, where you would sit in a sealed box while mercury vapor was released. The side effects included severe salivation, tooth loss, tremors, and even death from mercury poisoning. So, you'd either die from the disease or die from the cure, which was seen as part of the penance for your cursed state. It wasn't exactly a fun time to be alive or infected. The perception of syphilis as a curse had a profound impact on social attitudes. People with the disease were often ostracized, not just because of fear of contagion, but because they were seen as morally corrupt. Prostitutes, in particular, were singled out and condemned, even though the disease spread through all social strata. The narrative was simple if you had the pox. You had sinned. This moral judgment clung to the disease for centuries, even long after medical understanding began to improve. A common historical truth that syphilis vividly illustrates is that new and terrifying diseases are often immediately attributed to external blame, be it foreign enemies, divine wrath, or moral failings before any scientific understanding can emerge. The human mind, when faced with the inexplicable, seeks a narrative, a reason, and often a scapegoat. Syphilis, with its particular mode of transmission, provided a ready-made moral explanation that resonated deeply with the religious and societal norms of the time. An obscure detail about the great pox and curses is the phenomenon of syphilitic nose prosthetics. As the disease progressed, it could literally eat away at the bridge of the nose, leaving a horrifying, disfiguring void. To cope with this, people in the wealthier classes would sometimes commission elaborate prosthetic noses made of silver, gold, or even papier-mâché. Painted to match their skin tone, these were worn to conceal the visible curse and maintain some semblance of normalcy. Highlighting the intense social stigma associated with the disfigurement, you were literally trying to cover up the physical manifestation of your moral damnation. Historians still debate whether the initial rapid spread of syphilis in Europe was indeed solely linked to the return of Columbus's crew, or if there were milder forms of treponemal diseases already present in Europe that mutated or became more virulent. The Columbian exchange theory is strong, but some scholars suggest a more complex epidemiological picture. Regardless of its exact origin, its sudden and horrific appearance certainly fueled the widespread belief in its being a direct, morally charged curse. As you consider the agonizing pain and profound shame of those afflicted by the Great Pox, remember that for centuries, their suffering wasn't just a medical condition, it was a public declaration of their perceived sin, a curse that branded them both physically and morally. The terror of syphilis wasn't just about dying, it was about dying in disgrace, carrying the visible marks of a divine judgment. It's a chilling reminder of how deeply intertwined disease and morality became in the human psyche, and how the fear of a curse could add an unbearable layer of suffering to already devastating physical afflictions. You're now stepping into the more intimate, often heartbreaking realm of everyday life, focusing on the most vulnerable members of society, children. For centuries, when a child fell ill with an unexplained ailment, when they wasted away or suffered from sudden, violent fits, the fear wasn't just of the illness itself, it was the chilling possibility that their innocent life was being touched, or even claimed, by something far more sinister, the evil eye or the malevolent wishes of a jealous individual. Imagine a small, bustling household in, say, 17th century rural England. A new baby is born, beautiful and healthy. The family rejoices. Neighbors come to admire. But then, a few weeks later, the baby becomes inconsolably ill. It cries endlessly, refusing to feed. Its eyes seem glazed over. Or perhaps it suffers from strange tremors. What's the immediate thought of the exhausted, terrified parents before the age of pediatrics and antibiotics, when infant mortality was tragically high? Such an occurrence was often attributed not to infection or genetic defect, but to a curse. Specifically, the malevolent gaze of the evil eye. The belief in the evil eye is one of the most ancient and widespread superstitions across cultures, from the Mediterranean to the Middle East, parts of Asia, and throughout Europe. It posits that a person, often unconsciously, can inflict harm, misfortune, or illness upon another simply by looking at them with envy, malice, or even excessive admiration. For children, who were seen as particularly vulnerable and pure, this belief was exceptionally potent. You might be a proud parent showing off your bonny baby, and a neighbor, perhaps genuinely envious of your good fortune, casts an admiring glance and suddenly, your child sickens. The blame wasn't necessarily for intentional malice, but for a powerful, negative energy projected by another. This wasn't just folklore, it profoundly influenced how children were raised and protected. You'd see amulets placed in cribs charms like blue beads, red ribbons, or tiny bells, all designed to deflect the evil eye. Parents might avoid excessive praise for their children, fearing that drawing too much attention could make them targets. Grandparents might spit on a child after giving a compliment, A symbolic act to ward off the envious gaze? It sounds quaint now, but for them, it was a very real, very tangible threat to their child's life. Consider the symptoms of common childhood illnesses through this lens. A sudden, high fever in an infant, possibly due to a bacterial infection, could be interpreted as the child burning up from the heat of an evil glance. Diarrhea and vomiting, common and dangerous for infants, might be seen as the child's insides being churned by malevolent forces. Wasting sickness, where a child gradually loses weight and strength, perhaps due to malnutrition or chronic infection, could be attributed to a curse sucking the life out of them. And most terrifyingly, epileptic seizures in children, with their uncontrolled movements and loss of consciousness, were almost universally seen as demonic possession or the direct result of a powerful hex. Requiring exorcism rather than medical care, the helplessness of parents in the face of such illnesses, combined with high infant mortality rates, made the concept of the evil eye or a curse a tragically appealing explanation. It provided a framework, however terrifying, for understanding why an apparently healthy child could suddenly sicken and die. It was easier to blame an invisible, malevolent force than to confront the terrifying randomness of early death, or the limitations of their own medical knowledge. The remedies for such cursed ailments were varied, often blending folk magic with religious elements. You might take your sick child to a local wise woman who would perform rituals involving holy water, specific herbs, or even the careful placement of certain objects around the child's bed. Charms and talismans were ubiquitous in some regions. A piece of red string tied around the wrist or ankle was believed to ward off curses. In others, a raw egg might be passed over the child's body to absorb the negative energy. These acts weren't just about superstition. They were desperate attempts by loving parents to protect their most precious and vulnerable possessions. A common historical truth about childhood afflictions and curses is that the belief provided a framework for coping with high infant mortality rates in the absence of medical understanding. When so many children died young from unexplained causes, attributing these deaths to external supernatural forces, like the evil eye or a curse, offered a way for grieving parents to rationalize their profound loss and helplessness. It allowed them to believe there was a cause. Even if that cause was steeped in magic, an obscure detail about the evil eye in children concerns the practice of sympathetic magic or transfer rituals. If a child was believed to be suffering from the evil eye, a common remedy involved transferring the curse to an animal, often a goat or a chicken. The animal would be brought close to the child, and then, through ritualistic actions or incantations, the illness was supposedly transferred to the creature, if the animal then sickened or died. It was seen as proof that the curse had been lifted from the child. A bit rough on the animal, but for desperate parents, any hope was a lifeline. Historians still debate whether the pervasive belief in the evil eye, particularly concerning children's health, served primarily as a psychological coping mechanism for communities facing unpredictable illness, or if it also played a role in social control, subtly discouraging envy and excessive pride within communities. Was it simply a way to explain misfortune? Or did it subtly regulate social interactions and expressions of wealth or joy? The enduring nature of the belief suggests it filled a deep human need for explanation and protection. As you reflect on the tender, fragile lives of children in these past eras, and the overwhelming fear that a simple glance could bring illness or even death, you feel the profound anxiety of parents who had no scientific answers, their desperate embrace of amulets, rituals, and the belief in curses was not born of malice, but of boundless love and a terrifying helplessness. It's a poignant reminder of how deeply the fear of the unseen, the touch of a curse, could permeate the most innocent and vulnerable corners of human life. You're now venturing into one of the most unsettling and misunderstood realms of human suffering: mental illness. for centuries, long before the advent of psychiatry or neuroscience. The erratic behaviors, hallucinations, profound despair, or violent outbursts associated with mental health conditions were rarely, if ever, seen as a medical issue instead. You'd likely witness these terrifying symptoms attributed to something far more sinister: demonic possession or a powerful, malevolent curse. Imagine you're in a medieval European village, perhaps even earlier in ancient Greece or Rome. You see a person you know, someone who was once lucid and engaged, now muttering to themselves, seeing visions, or perhaps lashing out in a fit of uncontrollable rage. Their eyes are wild, their movements disjointed. To your bewildered mind, this isn't a problem with the brain, it's a battle for the soul, the common. Terrifying conclusion would be that this person is no longer themselves. They are possessed by a demon, or their mind has been cursed by a witch or an evil spirit. The lack of understanding about the brain's complex functions meant that any deviation from normal behavior was ripe for supernatural interpretation. Conditions we now recognize as schizophrenia, with its auditory and visual hallucinations, disorganized thoughts, and paranoid delusions, were almost textbook cases of demonic invasion. Someone hearing voices would be believed to be hearing the whispers of the devil or his minions. A person experiencing paranoid delusions, convinced they were being persecuted by unseen forces, was seen as being directly targeted by evil entities. Similarly, severe depression, especially with its debilitating lethargy, profound sadness, and withdrawal from the world, could be interpreted as a soul weighed down by a demonic curse, or simply the presence of an oppressive, malevolent spirit sucking the joy and life force from an individual. Manic episodes, characterized by periods of intense euphoria, racing thoughts, and reckless behavior, might be seen as a person temporarily invigorated or controlled by an energetic, mischievous demon. It's truly a horrifying thought. Isn't it to not only suffer the internal torment of mental illness, but to also be publicly branded as a vessel for evil? The remedies for such cursed mental states were, as you might expect, brutal and often counterproductive if you were believed to be possessed. The primary intervention was exorcism. This wasn't just a quiet prayer, it could be a physically violent ordeal involving restraints, forced ingestion of foul-smelling concoctions, repeated chanting, and even flagellation, all aimed at literally beating or tormenting the demon out of the afflicted individual. Imagine the terror and confusion of someone already struggling with a severe mental illness. Now subjected to such a terrifying and painful cure, it was a further traumatization, often leading to worsening symptoms or even death. Then there was the belief in specific curses. If you angered a powerful sorcerer, or a neighbor with a reputation for dabbling in dark arts, they might place a curse upon your mind, leading to madness. This fear was particularly prevalent during periods of intense witch hunts, where any unusual behavior could be construed as evidence of a witch's curse or demonic influence. People displaying symptoms of Tourette's syndrome, with its involuntary vocalizations and tics, or severe OCD with its repetitive, ritualistic behaviors, might be seen as acting under the compulsion of an unseen, evil force rather than a neurological imbalance. The madhouses or asylums that began to emerge in later centuries were often more like prisons than hospitals. Places where those deemed mad or cursed were locked away, often chained, and subjected to harsh treatments, including bloodletting, purges, and various forms of restraint, all under the assumption that they needed to be purified or have the evil driven out. You weren't a patient, you were a problem, a danger, or a cursed soul. A common historical truth that becomes painfully clear when examining mental illness and curses is that the lack of scientific understanding often led to the demonization and brutal mistreatment of individuals suffering from treatable conditions, instead of compassion and care. They faced fear, ostracism, and often torture, all under the guise of curing them from a supernatural affliction. An obscure detail related to mental illness as a curse is the ancient Roman concept of larvae, or lemures, restless and malevolent spirits of the dead who were believed to cause madness, nightmares, and hauntings. If you suddenly developed symptoms of profound melancholy or obsessive behavior, it might be attributed to one of these spectral entities clinging to your soul. The Roman festival of Lemuralia involved specific rituals and offerings to appease these spirits and prevent them from causing mental distress. A fascinating blend of ghost story and psychiatric explanation. So, your depression might just be caused by an angry ghost from the past, trying to mess with your head. Historians still debate whether the widespread belief in demonic possession as a cause of mental illness in medieval and early modern Europe was primarily a result of genuine religious conviction, or if it was a convenient explanation for baffling conditions that preserved the social order and reinforced the power of religious authorities. Was it a sincere attempt to understand, or a tool for control? It's likely a complex interplay, but the consequences for those affected were uniformly dire, as you contemplate the silent suffering of those whose minds betrayed them, and the terrifying ways in which their anguish was interpreted as a supernatural curse. You feel the chilling weight of ignorance and fear. To be mentally ill in these times was to be doubly cursed, afflicted by your own mind, and condemned by a society that saw you as an embodiment of evil. It's a stark reminder of how deeply the fear of the curse could permeate not just the body, but the very essence of human consciousness. You're now plummeting into one of the darkest, most terrifying chapters in human history, the mid-14th century, specifically the years between 1346 and 1353. The air is no longer just cool or misty. It's thick with an ominous dread, the stench of sickness, and the chilling silence of abandonment. This is the era of the Black Death, a pandemic so devastating it wiped out an estimated 30% to 50% of Europe's population, and for which the prevailing explanation, in the face of such unimaginable horror, was often a terrifying and widespread divine curse. Imagine you're living in a bustling European city, say Florence or London. One day, a neighbor falls ill with a sudden high fever. Soon after, grotesque swellings, known as buboes, appear in their armpits and groin, turning black. Then dark spots appear on their skin, and within days, they are dead. But it doesn't stop there. Their family falls ill, then their street, then the entire city. The death toll is incomprehensible. Bodies pile up faster than they can be buried. Priests die hearing confessions. Doctors die trying to help. What do you do when everything you know, every structure of society, every comforting belief collapses around you in a world without any understanding of microscopic organisms? The sheer scale and speed of the Black Death were utterly inexplicable. It didn't discriminate between rich or poor, pious or sinful, young or old. It struck down entire families, emptied villages, and left vast tracts of land desolate. When faced with such an overwhelming and indiscriminate catastrophe, the most readily available and profoundly terrifying explanation was that God had cursed humanity. This wasn't just a curse, it was the curse. A direct and cataclysmic punishment for humanity's collective sins. You'd hear sermons from every pulpit proclaiming the plague as God's righteous wrath. Perhaps it was a punishment for pride, for greed, for lust, or for a general decline in piety. Every sermon, every desperate prayer, reinforced the idea that this plague was a divine judgment, a purgation of sinful humanity. This belief, while offering a theological explanation, also plunged people into an even deeper despair. For if God himself had condemned them, what hope was there? You weren't just dying of a disease, you were dying under the weight of divine fury. This perception led to desperate and often irrational attempts to appease God or to find scapegoats. You might see groups of flagellants, penitents who would whip themselves publicly, believing that self-mutilation and suffering could atone for sins and lift the divine curse. They would march from town to town, their bare backs bloody, chanting prayers, believing their torment would save others. It's a stark image. Isn't it a collective expression of guilt and terror? Born from the conviction that the plague was a spiritual affliction, the fear of a curse also led to widespread persecution. With no scientific explanation for the plague, communities often turned on minority groups. Jews, for example, were tragically accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. Seen as agents of the devil or the cause of the divine curse, this led to horrific massacres across Europe. A chilling testament to how the belief in a curse, when combined with fear and prejudice, could unleash unimaginable human cruelty. You can almost feel the mob mentality, driven by terror and the desperate need to blame someone for the unfolding catastrophe beyond the divine. Some even looked to the heavens, attributing the plague to a cosmic curse or an unfortunate alignment of planets. Astrologers and scholars pondered the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius, suggesting it released a poisonous vapor that caused the plague, while seemingly more scientific than a direct divine wrath. It was still a form of celestial curse, an unpropitious cosmic influence that brought about death and disease. It was an attempt to find order in chaos, even if that order was dictated by the stars. The utter helplessness you'd feel, seeing your family, your friends, your entire world crumble around you, only solidified the belief in a curse. What else could explain such indiscriminate, overwhelming death? No earthly power could stop it. No known remedy seemed to work. It had to be something beyond human control, beyond human understanding. It had to be a curse. A common historical truth exemplified by the Black Death is that in times of unprecedented crisis and lack of scientific understanding, humanity often defaults to supernatural explanations, particularly divine punishment or widespread curses, to make sense of overwhelming suffering. The Black Death was the ultimate test of faith and reason, and for most, faith in a vengeful God, or a world under a cosmic curse. Provided the only available framework for understanding, an obscure detail related to the Black Death and curses is the belief in miasma theory preceding germ theory. While not strictly a curse in the supernatural sense, miasma theory proposed that diseases like the plague were caused by bad air or noxious fumes emanating from decaying organic matter. In a way, it was a practical application of the curse idea, an environmental curse, a toxic emanation from the earth itself that brought sickness. People would carry sweet-smelling herbs, light fires, or avoid foul areas, essentially trying to ward off this unseen. Cursed air? You might walk around with a posy of flowers, hoping it would ward off the deadly bad smells that were believed to cause the sickness. Historians still debate whether the immense spiritual and theological impact of the Black Death permanently altered religious belief and practice in Europe, leading to a more individualistic piety or questioning of church authority. Did it solidify the belief in a vengeful God, or did it push people towards seeking more personal spiritual solace? It's clear that the experience of such a profound curse left an indelible mark on the collective psyche, shaping religious thought for centuries to come. As you stand amidst the ghostly silence of a plague-ravaged city, the air heavy with unspoken prayers and the memory of countless lost lives, you feel the chilling weight of a curse on an epic scale. The Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was a societal cataclysm interpreted as a divine judgment, a chilling reminder of humanity's vulnerability and its desperate need to find meaning. Even if that meaning was etched in suffering and fear, you're now venturing far from the European continent. deep into the arid landscapes of ancient Egypt, stepping into the hushed, treasure-laden darkness of a pharaoh's tomb. The air is cool, still, carrying the scent of ancient dust and the faintest hint of something metallic, something old. This is where the terrifying, enduring legend of the curse of the pharaohs truly took root, turning inexplicable illnesses and unfortunate accidents into the vengeful workings of a long-dead king. Imagine it's the early 20th century. The world is gripped by the thrilling news of Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, an unparalleled archaeological find bursting with gold and untold riches. You're following the newspapers, reading about the painstaking work, the incredible artifacts. Then something sinister begins to unfold. Lord Carnarvon, Carter's financial backer, dies suddenly of a mosquito bite just months after the tomb's opening. Other members of the expedition, or those associated with it, begin to experience a series of strange illnesses, accidents, and even deaths. What's the collective gasp across the globe? The Pharaoh's curse? This wasn't just idle speculation, it became a full-blown media sensation. Fueled by sensationalist journalism and the public's fascination with the mystical East, the idea was simple, yet chilling anyone who dared to disturb the eternal slumber of a pharaoh. To violate their sacred resting place would be struck down by a supernatural force, a curse invoked by the pharaoh himself or by the gods protecting his tomb. It was a terrifying thought. You could be thousands of years removed from ancient Egypt, but the wrath of its rulers could still reach out from the afterlife and claim you. The symptoms attributed to this curse were varied and often vague, making them easy to fit into the narrative. Lord Carnarvon's death from an infected mosquito bite became a prime example. Other supposed victims suffered from fevers, mysterious ailments, or sudden, inexplicable illnesses that baffled doctors. One archaeologist reportedly died of exhaustion, another from a sudden chill. If someone involved in the expedition simply tripped and broke their leg, it could be spun as the curse weakening their resolve, making them clumsy. Any misfortune, however mundane, became evidence of the pharaoh's vengeful spirit. The appeal of the curse narrative was powerful. It satisfied a human need for dramatic explanation, especially for unexpected misfortunes. It also added an almost poetic justice to the disturbance of ancient graves. You were not just robbing a tomb, you were provoking a supernatural entity. And the pharaohs themselves had certainly done their part to encourage such beliefs. Many ancient tombs carried actual inscriptions warning trespassers of divine wrath or dire consequences for disturbing the dead. These were intended to be deterrents, a form of spiritual security system for the afterlife. Of course, from a scientific perspective, there are far more rational explanations for the illnesses and deaths. Tombs, especially those sealed for millennia, are not sterile environments. They can harbor dangerous molds, bacteria, and fungi that thrive in confined, damp spaces. Inhaling spores from these pathogens could easily cause respiratory infections or other ailments in individuals with compromised immune systems or allergies. Additionally, some ancient burial practices involved toxic substances like arsenic, which could be released into the air upon opening a tomb. So, an archaeologist spending days breathing in dust and spores in a confined space might well develop a cough, fever, or worse. The curse could simply be the ancient equivalent of a particularly nasty dose of environmental illness. Furthermore, the pressure and stress of such a monumental archaeological undertaking, combined with the extreme climate of Egypt, could take a toll on anyone's health. Long hours, physical exertion, and the exotic diseases endemic to the region like malaria, which caused Carnarvon's fatal bite, were all very real threats. But these mundane explanations lacked the thrilling, chilling allure of a supernatural curse. Who wants to read a headline that says, "Archaeologist contracts mild fungal infection from tomb dust"? No. Pharaoh's vengeance strikes again sells far more papers. A common historical truth that the Curse of the Pharaohs perfectly illustrates is how sensational media, combined with human fascination for the unknown, can amplify and perpetuate ancient superstitions. Even in an increasingly scientific age, the story of the curse was more exciting than the reality, demonstrating the powerful allure of a dramatic, supernatural narrative. An obscure detail that often gets overlooked in the curse narrative is that Howard Carter, the very man who discovered the tomb and spent the most time inside it, lived for another 16 years after the opening, dying of natural causes at the age of 64. This inconvenient fact doesn't quite fit the narrative of a relentless curse. Does it? If anyone should have fallen victim, it would have been him. It's a reminder that selective reporting and confirmation bias play a huge role in perpetuating such legends. Historians still debate whether the specific warnings inscribed in some ancient Egyptian tombs were genuinely intended as magical curses, or if they were more rhetorical deterrents designed to intimidate potential grave robbers. Were the Egyptians truly expecting a spirit to rise and smite an intruder? Or were they just trying to scare people off with a stern, religiously backed warning? It's a subtle distinction, but one that speaks to the true nature of their beliefs and intentions. As you close your eyes, envisioning the golden sarcophagus within the tomb's depths, and the subsequent string of unexplained misfortunes, you can almost hear the whispers of the journalists, the terrified murmurs of the public, and the chilling silence of those who succumbed. The Curse of the Pharaohs stands as a testament to the enduring power of ancient beliefs, transforming mundane illnesses into supernatural warnings, and reminding us how easily the human mind can weave a terrifying narrative around the inexplicable. You're now fast-forwarding to the present day, or at least the recent past, bridging the vast chasm between ancient superstition and modern science. It might surprise you, but even with microscopes, advanced diagnostics, and a deep understanding of pathophysiology, the concept of curses still subtly echoes in our contemporary beliefs, particularly when faced with chronic illnesses or inexplicable misfortunes that defy easy medical explanation. Imagine a friend, or perhaps even you, grappling with a debilitating chronic illness, one that doctors struggle to diagnose or treat effectively. Perhaps it's a mysterious autoimmune disorder, a persistent fatigue syndrome, or a collection of strange, debilitating symptoms that don't fit neatly into any known disease category. You've seen countless specialists, undergone endless tests, and yet the answers remain elusive. The frustration, the helplessness, and the sheer psychological toll can be immense. And in that void of medical certainty, for some, the whispered question still arises, is this some kind of curse? You might hear it in the subtle ways. I just feel like I'm cursed with bad luck when it comes to my health. Or, it's like this illness is following my family, a generational curse. While not overtly stating a witch or a god has directly afflicted them, the language of curse becomes a shorthand for deeply ingrained misfortune or an inexplicable pattern of suffering. It's a way of trying to make sense of the senseless, even when medical science falls short. Consider the feeling of medical gaslighting that some patients experience when their symptoms are dismissed or not fully understood by the medical establishment. When doctors can't find a clear cause, and a patient continues to suffer, the psychological space opens up for alternative explanations, including the idea that there's some unseen, perhaps even malevolent, force at play. It's not about a belief in literal witchcraft, necessarily, but a deep-seated feeling that something beyond the tangible is working against them. You might feel like you're fighting an invisible enemy, a constant battle that drains you of hope. This isn't to say that modern people truly believe in ancient curses as the primary cause of their illness. Rather, it's about the lingering psychological remnants of those older beliefs. When science hits a wall, or when a series of unfortunate events conspire to create persistent suffering. The human mind, hardwired to seek patterns and meaning, can sometimes revert to more primal explanations. It's a testament to the enduring power of narrative. If there's no clear medical story, the mind can construct a curse narrative to provide a sense of agency. However negative, think about the concept of bad luck streaks applied to health. Someone might say, every time I recover from one thing, something else pops up. It's like I'm cursed. This isn't a medical diagnosis, but a lament, an expression of exasperation rooted in a pattern of misfortune. It's a cultural echo of the ancient idea that some people are simply marked for suffering. Even in the realm of psychology, some individuals struggling with severe, intractable mental health conditions might, in moments of extreme despair, internalize the idea of being cursed or broken beyond repair, while a therapist would approach this from a clinical perspective. The patient's lived experience can feel like an oppressive, inescapable doom. A mental curse that won't lift. A common historical truth that resonates even today is that when faced with prolonged or inexplicable suffering, humans will always seek explanations, and in the absence of clear scientific ones. Older, more mystical narratives about curses can offer a perverse sense of understanding. Even in modern times, it's about trying to impose order on chaos, even if that order is a negative one. An obscure detail that highlights this modern echo is the existence of curse removal or spiritual clearing services that still pop up in online communities or alternative healing circles. While often dismissed as fringe or exploitative, their continued presence suggests that a segment of the population, when faced with persistent bad luck, chronic undiagnosed ailments, or unexplained misfortune, still seeks solutions outside of conventional science, sometimes resorting to practices that conceptually align with ancient curse removal rituals. You might find a website offering to cleanse your aura to remove blockages that are causing your mysterious migraines. A direct descendant of ancient appeals to priests, historians still debate whether the persistence of curse-like language and beliefs in modern contexts represents a true continuity of ancient superstitions, or if it's a cultural shorthand for profound despair and a search for meaning in the face of medical uncertainty. Is it a genuine, albeit subconscious, belief in a supernatural influence, or merely a metaphor for feeling overwhelmingly unlucky? The nuanced reality is likely somewhere in between, but the language certainly remains. As you consider the struggles of those navigating the complexities of modern medicine and still feeling the weight of inexplicable suffering, you can almost hear the faint echoes of ancient fears. The very human need to understand why bad things happen, why illness strikes seemingly at random, continues to resonate, even in an age of reason. The shadow of the curse, transformed and muted, still occasionally falls upon the landscape of human affliction. A quiet reminder of how deeply ingrained these old narratives truly are. You've journeyed through millennia, from the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia to the dimly lit medieval villages, from the terror of new plagues to the hushed mystery of ancient tombs, and finally, to the subtle anxieties of our modern world. Now, you stand at the precipice of understanding, watching humanity's slow, arduous journey from the shadows of superstition to the illuminating light of scientific inquiry, grappling with the enduring human need to find meaning in suffering. This final chapter is about unraveling the mystery science versus superstition. Imagine yourself standing at the dawn of the Enlightenment, perhaps in a bustling European city like London or Paris. Around the 18th century, the air crackles with new ideas. Scientists like Isaac Newton have revealed the predictable laws governing the cosmos. Physicians are beginning to experiment with empirical observation. The old ways of thinking, where every illness was a divine punishment or a witch's hex, are slowly, agonizingly, starting to recede, challenged by a new, powerful force reason. You can almost hear the quiet hum of laboratories replacing the frantic chants of exorcists. This transition wasn't swift or easy. For centuries, the belief in curses held powerful sway because it offered a complete, if terrifying, explanation. If your child died of a fever, a curse explained it. If a plague swept through, divine wrath was the answer. Science, in its infancy, had few answers to offer beyond observation. But slowly, painstakingly, the pieces began to come together. Think about the revolutionary understanding of germ theory in the 19th century, spearheaded by giants like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Suddenly, the invisible killers that had haunted humanity for millennia began to reveal themselves, not as malevolent spirits or divine curses, but as microscopic organisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi. You could literally see them under a microscope. Tiny, squirming entities responsible for illnesses previously attributed to the evil eye or a vengeful god. The Black Death wasn't a curse, it was Yersinia pestis. Leprosy wasn't a divine brand, it was Mycobacterium leprae. Syphilis wasn't a moral punishment, it was Treponema pallidum. This was a game changer, peeling back layers of fear and replacing them with observable, testable facts. But even with germ theory, the human mind's need for meaning persists. When a loved one battles cancer, or a rare genetic disorder, or a chronic autoimmune condition that modern medicine struggles to fully comprehend, that ancient yearning for explanation can resurface. Science can tell you what is happening at a cellular level, but it sometimes struggles to explain why it happened to you. That why is where the lingering echoes of the curse often reside. You might not believe in a literal curse, but you might feel a profound sense of unfairness, a cosmic injustice, which is a modern secular echo of the ancient spiritual dilemma. Consider the shift in how we approach mental illness, from being demonically possessed or cursed with madness. We now understand conditions like schizophrenia and depression as complex neurological and psychological disorders, thanks to advances in neuroscience, psychiatry, and therapy. Individuals who once would have been subjected to brutal exorcisms or locked away in asylums can now receive medication, counseling, and support. The curse has been replaced by a diagnosis, and often, a pathway to management and recovery. This is not to say stigma has disappeared, but the understanding has profoundly shifted. You are no longer seen as a vessel for evil, but as a person with a treatable condition, yet you still find moments where the old ways surface. The fascination with the curse of Tutankhamun persists, less as a genuine belief, perhaps, and more as a thrilling cultural narrative. The idea that something runs in the family, and might be it bad luck or certain ailments, often carries an underlying resonance with the concept of a generational curse, even if expressed in modern terms like genetic predisposition. The language changes, but the core human desire to explain patterns of suffering remains. The journey from believing in a physical ailment caused by an angry god to understanding a disease caused by a microscopic organism is one of humanity's greatest intellectual triumphs. It required courage to challenge established beliefs, relentless curiosity, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It replaced fear of the unknown with the pursuit of knowledge, turning inexplicable curses into solvable puzzles. A common historical truth is that the human tendency to seek meaning and blame for suffering is deeply ingrained. And scientific advancement, while providing rational explanations, doesn't always fully erase the emotional or existential need for answers that sometimes transcend the purely biological. Even when we know the how, we still wrestle with the why. An obscure detail that shows the bridge between these worlds is the use of folk remedies, or traditional medicine, alongside modern treatments in some cultures. even today, while not always framed as curse removal. Some practices aimed at balancing energy or clearing blockages for chronic illness have conceptual links to ancient ideas of removing negative influences that might have once been considered curses. You might still find someone putting a red string on a baby's wrist for protection. Even while diligently following vaccine schedules, historians still debate whether the scientific revolution truly eradicated the deeper, psychological need for supernatural explanations for suffering, or if it simply pushed these beliefs into more subtle or secular forms. Did we truly stop believing in curses, or did we just rename them as bad luck, karma, or genetic predisposition? The ongoing fascination with fortune telling, alternative healing, and the enduring power of narrative suggests that the human search for meaning, even when suffering remains a complex tapestry of science and subtle superstition. As you conclude this journey through humanity's long struggle with disease and the concept of curses, you can almost hear the soft, reassuring hum of a modern medical scanner, a testament to how far we've come. Yet, alongside that, there's the faintest echo of an ancient whispered prayer, a reminder that the profound human need to understand why suffering exists, to find meaning in the midst of pain, is a narrative that continues to unfold, forever intertwining the known with the deeply felt unknown.